The camp did not return to normal after that salute. The recruits walked with stiff shoulders and restless eyes. Their whispers no longer carried laughter but trembled with questions they did not know how to ask for the salute of the SEAL commander. It was not a mistake. It was deliberate. It was respect shown openly before them all, and it shattered every story they had told about her tattoo. They could no longer call it meaningless. They could no longer dismiss it as ink chosen on a whim for if. The commander himself honored it. Then it carried weight far beyond their understanding. She returned to her duties as though nothing had changed her hands, stacking magazines, her boots moving with the same calm rhythm, her eyes steady on her work. She spoke to no one, offered no explanation, and gave no sign that the salute had unsettled her in any way. But the recruits could not look at her. The wing tattoo they once mocked, now burned in their minds as a mark they were unworthy to. Even question-some kept their distance as though afraid to stand too close. Others watched her with wide eyes, hoping to catch even a hint of the truth. That night the mess hall was a hollow place, filled with silence, broken only by the scrape of trays and the clatter of utensils. No one dared laugh. No one dared whisper. The recruits sat stiff and quiet, glancing toward her table. She sat alone as always, her tray untouched as always. Her sleeve loose enough for the tattoo to show none of them, could tear their eyes away, and yet none of them had the courage to approach her. The memory of the salute lingered like a shadow over their heads, and they knew they would never see her as ordinary again. The colonel could not sleep. His mind replayed. The moment over and over, the commander standing still, his eyes on her wrist. The salute raised sharp and deliberate, and her calm return as though she had expected it. He walked his quarters restless, his eyes falling again on the folder lying open. On his desk, the file with blacked-out lines, the code name written in the margins, and the faint description of wings earned in silence. He realized then that the salute had confirmed what he had already suspected. She was not a rumor. She was not a story. She was the living truth. He called her into his quarters at dawn, the folder open on the table, the code name visible. She stepped inside quietly, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The colonel asked her directly what the salute meant. He asked if the tattoo was the mark of that code name, the one buried beneath black lines in the file. She did not answer with words. She only looked at the folder, then at him, her silence carrying more weight than speech. Her eyes told him enough, and yet not enough to ease the storm inside his mind. He pressed again, demanding to know why she hid her truth, why she allowed the recruits to laugh when she could silence them with a single sentence. She finally spoke, her voice quiet and steady. She told him that legends survived because they were not spoken aloud. She said the wing tattoo was not meant for recognition. It was a memory etched into her flesh, so she would never forget. She said the salute was not for her as a woman, but for what the mark represented for the ghosts of those who had not returned from the mission that had given it to her. She told him that silence was her shield, her way of protecting what was bigger than herself. The colonel listened, his chest heavy. His hands tight on the edge of the desk. Her words cut deeper than he expected. They carried truth, but also warning. He realized she had no intention of claiming the code name openly, no desire to explain herself to soldiers who had mocked what they did, not understand she carried the tattoo, not to show pride but to remember. And silence was her only answer, because words would never be enough. Later that day, the commander himself spoke quietly to the colonel away from the ears of the recruits. His words low but sharp. He told him that some marks were not meant to be explained, that the wing tattoo was one of them. He said she had earned it in a place few survived, and that was all the colonel needed to know the commander's eyes carried steel. As he added that respect was not optional when it came to her, and that any man foolish enough to mock her again would answer for it. The colonel nodded, but inside his unease grew stronger, for he now knew her past was heavier than he imagined, and yet it was still hidden, still unspoken. He wondered how long such silence could last in a camp filled with restless whispers. He looked at her across the yard, later her sleeve slipping back as she lifted another crate, the wing tattoo catching the sun. And in that moment he understood the whispers would never stop. The silence would never be enough to keep the truth buried forever, and he knew the breaking point was near, though he did not know what form it would take, only that when it came, the camp would never be the same. The dawn came gray and still, the camp waking under a sky that felt heavier than usual. The recruits moved through their routines with stiff shoulders and darting glances as though waiting for something they could not name. The colonel walked the yard with a clenched jaw, the folder still haunting him, the salute still echoing in his mind. He felt the weight of something unspoken pressing closer with each hour. She worked as always, her steps steady, her silence. Unbroken her sleeve, brushing against her wrist, the wing tattoo catching the faint light whenever the fabric slipped. No one dared speak to her. Now their curiosity drowned beneath their fear. The mark had become a symbol they did not understand, and the not knowing gnawed at them more than laughter ever had. By midday, the commander returned without warning, his presence striking the camp into rigid attention. His eyes scanned the soldiers quickly, but settled again on her standing calm among them. He stepped forward, and the recruits held their breath. The colonel stiffened his chest, tight with expectation. The commander stopped before her, his gaze falling on the wing tattoo once more, then lifting to her eyes. In that silence he raised his hand again in salute. But this time his voice followed, low, steady, and sharp. He spoke words the recruits would never forget. He told them the wing tattoo was not decoration, it was not vanity, it was not ink chosen in youth. He said it was earned. In a mission no man wanted to remember, a mission from which most never returned, he said she had carried out the impossible when others fell, and she bore the mark as memory, not pride. The recruits stood frozen, their eyes wide, their breath caught. In their throats, the colonel listened with pounding heart, every word striking him with force. Yet the commander said no more. He gave no details. He offered no names. He only gave them that truth, that the wing tattoo marked her as something beyond their understanding, and that was all they needed to know. She did not speak. She did not nod. She only stood silent, her face unreadable, her wrist bare in the light, as if to let them all see it fully. For the first time, the recruits felt the weight of it pressing on their chests, the silence of her past, heavier than the rifles they carried, heavier than the armor on their backs. That night the camp was quiet, but it was no longer restless, it was reverent. The recruits sat in silence at their tables, their gazes drifting toward her, but not with mockery. Now with respect, raw and uneasy, but real. They no longer whispered, they no longer guessed, they no longer dared. She remained the same, silent, calm, steady. But the air around her had shifted, forever. The colonel returned to his quarters, the folder still open on his desk. He looked at the blacked-out lines, the code names scrawled in the margins, the faint description of wings earned in silence. He closed it slowly and locked it away, for he understood now that some truths were not meant for paper. Some truths were meant only to be carried in silence by those strong enough to bear them. The commander left before dawn the next morning, his departure as quiet as his arrival, but his shadow lingered over the camp. The recruits carried themselves differently, their eyes sharper, their posture steadier. They had seen respect. They had seen silence, and they understood now that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in the quiet, in the unseen, in the weight, carried alone. She continued as before, her tasks unchanged, her silence steady, her tattoo hidden, then revealed as her sleeve slipped, and each time it showed, the recruits straightened their spines without thought. Their eyes filled with something close to awe. They knew they would never learn the full story. They knew the silence would never break, but they no longer needed the details. The salute, the words, the weight was enough. The colonel watched her across the yard, his thoughts heavy. He wondered how long she could carry such silence, how long before the past demanded more than memory. He knew the salute had changed the camp, but he also knew it had placed a target on her that none of them could see, and he feared what would come when the silence finally broke. The sky darkened over the camp that evening, the air thick with the coming of a storm. The recruits worked quickly to secure equipment. The colonel stood at the edge of the yard, the folder, locked away. The commander gone, and she stood beneath the gray clouds, her wrist bare, the wing tattoo catching the fading light. And in that moment they all felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing closer, the silence holding one last secret, waiting to break. The barracks were restless that night, the air thick with heat and whispers. The recruits circled their bunks, trading stories about the tattoo on her wrist. They spoke as if they knew the truth, but each tale contradicted the last one swore she had been branded with the mark as punishment for failing a mission. Another claimed she had chosen it herself to look tougher. The words bounced back and forth louder with every telling, until the sound filled the room like a swarm. Then the door opened, and she stepped inside, and the voices died instantly. She moved without hurry, her boots steady her face, calm her eyes forward. She crossed the room toward her bunk, and sat down, her wrist bare in the dim light, the tattoo visible against her skin. The recruits stared, waiting for her to notice them, waiting for her to speak, but she said nothing, her silence louder than their laughter had been. She reached into her pack, pulled out a small notebook, and began to write, her hand moving quickly. Across the page, her face expressionless, as if she had forgotten they were even there. The recruits shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado drained into silence. One of them finally whispered a joke about the tattoo, his voice trembling as he said, "Maybe she wrote about her failures every night." The others chuckled nervously, but their eyes never left her. She paused for a moment mid-sentence, then slowly closed the notebook. She lifted her wrist and stared at the ink herself, her gaze heavy and distant, like she was seeing something none of them could see. Her fingers traced the edge of the wing, and the room felt colder. In that moment, the recruits stopped breathing, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to react. But she gave them nothing, only that silent stare at her own wrist, as though the tattoo pulled her back to another time, another place. When she finally lowered her arm, her face revealed nothing, and she slid the notebook back into her pack. The recruits looked at each other, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Then she rose to her feet and walked slowly out of the room, leaving behind only the sound of her boots fading in the corridor. The silence that followed was heavier than anything they had felt before. The recruits tried to laugh again, but the sound felt wrong. Forced, one of them whispered that she had looked like she was remembering something terrible. Another said she must have seen death and carried it with her in the ink. They argued softly about what the tattoo meant, but none could shake the feeling that they had glimpsed something real, something not born of rumor but of truth, and that truth frightened them more than they wanted to admit. Later that night, the colonel walked past the barracks and saw the recruits wide awake, whispering nervously. He stepped inside, demanding to know why none were asleep. They stammered excuses, but he caught the glance of one soldier toward her empty bunk. The colonel said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. He knew whispers when he heard them, and he knew fear when he saw it. He left without a word, but his mind lingered on the woman with the tattoo, the one he had been watching quietly since she arrived. The following day, he called for the personnel, files reviewing records in his tent, his eyes scanning names, dates, assignments. Then he found a file not complete, but redacted, large sections blacked out. Yet enough remained to catch his attention. A code name scribbled in the margins, a mark described. Briefly, wings earned under circumstances only hinted at. And when he read the details, he felt a chill run down his spine. The description was sparse, but the truth within it was unmistakable, and it matched the woman walking silently among his soldiers. The colonel closed the file, but the thought would not leave him. He knew her tattoo was not ink chosen on a whim. He knew it was a symbol carried from a past the recruits could not imagine. He returned to the yard later that evening, watching her move. Among crates and magazines, calm and steady, her wrist bare, her tattoo catching the fading light, and he realized the recruits had been mocking not a decoration, but a memory carved into her skin. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered as she passed. And for the first time she looked back at him, their eyes locked, and in her silence he felt the weight of confirmation, though no words were spoken. The truth now pressed against the surface like a shadow threatening to break free, and the colonel knew it was only a matter of time before everyone else saw what he had already begun to understand. The morning broke heavy with clouds. The camp stirred awake with the usual clatter of boots and rifles. Yet beneath the routine was an unease. None could shake the whispers about her tattoo had grown too loud to ignore, and even those who once laughed with confidence now avoided her gaze when she walked past. She carried herself as if nothing touched her, moving through tasks with the same silent precision, stacking crates, counting magazines, signing reports, her sleeve riding up just enough for the wing tattoo to show, and every time it did, the recruits fell quiet, their voices failing against the weight of what they did not understand. The colonel watched more closely than ever. He had not spoken of the file he had read the night before, not even to his senior officers, but the words replayed in his mind, the redacted lines, the code name hidden in shadows, and the faint description of wings earned in blood. He studied her from a distance, the way her eyes never missed movement, the way her steps carried discipline far older than the young recruits around her. She did not need to prove anything, yet the proof lived in every motion she made in the mess hall. The whispers tried to rise again. One recruit said she was nothing. Another laughed and said the tattoo was fake, but their voices carried no weight. They spoke only to fill the silence that pressed down on them. And when she entered the room, they hushed quickly, turning back to their meals. She passed them without a glance, her tray untouched as always, her presence cutting through the air, sharper than words ever could. That afternoon, the camp shifted suddenly. Word spread like fire through dry grass. The SEAL commander was arriving unexpected, his visit unannounced. The recruits straightened uniforms, polished boots, and cleaned rifles, nerves rattling them into motion. The colonel stood at the gate waiting his mind heavy with what he knew and what he suspected. The air grew still as the commander's vehicle pulled in the soldiers, snapping to attention. When he stepped out, his figure tall, broad, his eyes sharp as he scanned the camp. The SEAL commander walked through the lines slowly, his boots striking the ground with measured weight. He carried authority without needing to speak. The recruits watched him with awe, their spines stiff, their shoulders square, yet his gaze passed over them all until it landed on her. She stood apart, not rushing, not stiff, her posture steady, her sleeve rolled just enough for the wing tattoo to show, and the moment his eyes saw it, he stopped. The air seemed to freeze, the silence falling thicker than fog. The recruits shifted nervously, unsure why the commander had paused, his gaze fixed not on the camp, not on the colonel, not on the rifles, but on the small mark on her wrist, the wing that had been mocked for weeks. The commander stepped forward, closing the distance. Until he stood in front of her, the soldiers watching in confusion, the colonel holding his breath. Then, without hesitation, the SEAL commander raised his hand sharply in salute, his voice unspoken, but his gesture louder than thunder. She looked at him, her face calm, her eyes steady. Then she returned the salute, her wrist raising high, the wing tattoo visible to all, and in that instant the recruits realized the truth. Though no words had been spoken, their laughter choked in their throats, their eyes wide as they understood the wing was not ink chosen at random. It was a mark recognized by one of the most feared and respected leaders among them. The commander's salute was not a mistake. It was honor. The silence that followed was suffocating. The commander lowered his hand and said nothing, but the weight of his gesture pressed on every soldier in the yard. They stood frozen, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The colonel watched with narrowed eyes, knowing this moment had changed. Everything her secret was no longer hidden, her silence no longer just a shield. The truth was breaking through, though still unspoken, and in that silence, everyone waited for the commander's words. Yet none came. He only stared at her once more, before turning away, leaving the salute to echo louder than any order could, and the recruits realized their world had shifted, though they did not yet understand how far the shift would reach. The air around her seemed different now, heavier, sharper, the whispers that would follow. This moment would no longer be jokes. They would be questions. Dangerous questions, and the soldiers knew they would not rest until they had answers, but none of them dared ask. Not yet. Because they all felt the weight of what had just happened, and the silence she carried was now matched by the silence of the SEAL commander, and that silence was far more terrifying than words. She sat quietly at the edge of the mess hall, her tray untouched, her sleeves rolled just high enough for the faint mark to show a wing tattoo etched across her wrist. The ink faded, but still sharp enough to catch the eye. The young recruits at the next table noticed it, and their laughter began low at first, then louder as they nudged one another, whispering about how she probably got it in some parlor on leave, a silly piece of art meant to make her look tougher than she was. None of them understood that she heard every word, yet her eyes stayed calm and her posture remained unbroken, as if she had lived through louder voices before. The tattoo was small, not flamboyant, not surrounded by color, just a single wing, dark and precise. It should have meant nothing to them yet. They laughed as though it were a badge of foolishness. One recruit leaned closer, whispering that maybe she had wanted to join Airborne but washed out. Maybe the wing was all she had left of the dream. Another said it looked like a cheap imitation of something greater. They smirked when she lifted her wrist to adjust her sleeve, the ink catching the light, the wing looking almost alive against her skin. She gave no answer, only the faintest curl of a smile. That unsettled the room more than words could have, for there was no embarrassment in her face. No shame, only something unreadable like a shadow hiding behind her eyes. The laughter grew uneasy. Some laughed harder to cover their discomfort. Others fell silent, unable to explain why the sight of her stillness made their stomachs tighten. She rose after a while, leaving the tray untouched, and walked past them. Her steps slow, steady, unbothered, and the sound of her boots against the floor carried, heavier than their scattered laughter. In the yard outside, she moved through the crates stacking magazines, recording numbers, a task that looked dull to the recruits, but her hands moved with precision. Too sharp, too fluid for routine, she counted. Faster than their eyes could follow, and every motion seemed to carry purpose, as though each magazine was more than a number. The recruits who had laughed moments earlier found themselves watching her now. Without knowing why, one whispered again about the tattoo, calling it a joke. But his voice cracked, and another hushed him quickly, afraid she might hear, though she showed no sign of paying attention. By evening, the story of the wing tattoo had spread further than the mess hall it carried, into the barracks, into the yard, into the whispers exchanged at night. Some said she wore it because she wanted to belong to something greater. Others claimed it marked her as a failure in some secret training. No one could confirm. The laughter followed. Her everywhere, but so too did unease, for none of them could shake the way she walked, the way she carried silence around her like armor. In the barracks one night they grew bolder, the recruits sitting in a circle trading stories about what they thought the tattoo meant. Some swore it was meaningless. Others argued that no one would mark themselves with wings without reason. They laughed louder, trying to drown the tension in their own voices. Then she walked in her wrist bare in the low, light the wing tattoo, catching their eyes again. The room fell silent as she looked at it herself for a long moment, her gaze not on them, but on the ink, as if it reminded her of something far beyond the walls. Then she lowered her sleeve and walked, away, her silence cutting deeper than their laughter. From that moment, the laughter changed it. No longer sounded carefree. It carried nerves beneath it. The recruits laughed because they did not understand, and what they did not understand unsettled them. They avoided her more than they mocked her. Yet the whispers continued louder each day, stories twisted with new details added each night. She ignored them all, stacking crates, moving magazines, writing numbers on clipboards, as though that was her world. Yet her silence told another story, and some began to wonder quietly what she was hiding. The older soldiers who had been watching from the background said nothing. They saw the way she moved. They recognized it, though they never spoke aloud. One veteran muttered that some tattoos were not chosen but earned. Another reminded him to keep quiet, and the subject died quickly. But the thought lingered. What if the wing was not decoration? What if it meant something far heavier than the recruits? Could imagine, as the days passed, the unease grew. She became a figure that unsettled the camp without trying her calmness. Her silence, her steady eyes were sharper than the rifles they trained with, and though the recruits still whispered their laughter, carried less conviction for, they felt something beneath the ink, something that did not belong to them, something that was not theirs to mock. She remained silent through it all, and the silence itself was what made them restless. And still the truth. Behind the wing tattoo, waited in the shadows unspoken, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough, and when that moment arrived, it would silence their laughter forever. The whispers about the wing tattoo did not fade. They grew, louder, carried from one recruit to the next until every corner of the camp seemed to know her wrist carried ink, and every voice tried to explain what it meant, though none knew the truth. Some said it was from her younger days when she was reckless, and foolish others insisted it was the mark of failure in a training program too demanding for her to endure. Each story twisted into another, until it was impossible to separate invention from reality, yet she never offered correction. Her silence left the recruits restless, and their imaginations did the rest in the mess hall. One group said she had tried to earn airborne wings but collapsed during the final jump training. Another swore she had begged to get into a unit and been turned away. The wing tattoo was all she carried to remind herself of what she could not achieve. The recruits laughed at these stories, slapping each other on the back as if they had discovered some secret truth. But when she entered the hall and walked past their table, their voices faltered, her calm presence pressing against their words like a weight. None of them could explain. They laughed louder after she left, but the sound rang hollow. Others began noticing details that unsettled them. Her way of walking always alert, never careless. The way her hands moved when handling weapons as though she had done it countless times before, even though they had never seen her on the range. The way her eyes scanned a room automatically reading exits and angles like a habit burned into her bones. These details whispered of something beyond their reach, something that clashed with the image of failure they wanted to believe. So they spoke louder and mocked harder to drown out the unease growing inside them. In the barracks at night, the stories took on new shapes. Recruits claimed she wore the tattoo to honor a fallen comrade. Some said she had once been part of a classified mission, and the ink was her only proof, though they said it with laughter. The shadows in the room made their voices softer, their words carrying a nervous edge. None wanted to admit some nights she sat at the far end of the room polishing gear or writing notes, her wrist visible in the low light, and the wing tattoo seemed to shift in the darkness like it held more weight than ink could carry. The laughter would stop then, as if the room itself listened. One evening, a bolder recruit tried to confront her, his voice mocking as he asked if the tattoo was supposed to mean something. His friends snickered behind him, waiting for her reaction. She looked at him once, her eyes steady, Not hostile, not angry, just steady, and the recruit froze, his words dying in his throat. The silence stretched heavy across the room until she turned back to her task without a word. The recruit forced a laugh, but no one joined him, and the quiet that followed lasted long after lights out. The older soldiers began to notice the shift. They saw how the recruits stumbled between laughter and fear, how they could not decide if she was a joke or something far more dangerous. One veteran muttered that the wing tattoo did not look like decoration. It looked like something earned through blood and sky. Another told him to keep such thoughts to himself because there were stories better left unsaid. Still, the thought spread quietly through the older ranks, who watched her with sharper eyes than before. The next day during drills, she stood at the edge observing while the recruits fired their rifles. Her presence was silent but undeniable. Some of the younger soldiers found themselves adjusting their aim more carefully, their hands steadier, as if her eyes alone demanded precision, even though she said nothing and offered no instruction. When one recruit asked aloud why she was even there, the sergeant ignored him. But she looked up for just a moment, and her gaze made the question die in his throat, the wing tattoo visible again when her sleeve shifted. By now the camp no longer saw her as invisible. She had become a presence that pulled eyes and whispers. Wherever she moved, the recruits told themselves she was nothing, but their voices trembled when they said it, because deep down they feared the opposite. Her silence was no longer empty. It was a shadow that seemed to hide something greater than their imaginations could reach. Still they laughed, because laughter was easier than admitting fear. But in their silence afterward, they all thought the same question. What did the wing tattoo really mean, and why did it seem like she was waiting for the day when the truth would no longer stay hidden?